So good afternoon, everyone. Thanks so much for being here today. My name is Ian Cromwell. It's my very great privilege to speak with you today. The topic I want to present is somewhat outside the usual mainstream discussion that happens within the skeptic community. I won't be talking about religion or alternative medicine, cosmology, biology, or any of the other, sort of hot topics in the skeptical world. Instead, today I'm going to be giving a skeptic point of view on race and racism. There's going to be four principal components of my talk today. First, I'm going to talk to you about some of the particular challenges associated with defining the concept of race. Next, we're going to go through a definition of racism, followed by a handful of potential approaches to combating it. And finally, I'm going to speak briefly about how the skeptic movement and philosophy is particularly well-suited to explore these issues. So before we get into the discussion, I'd like to tell you a bit about who I am. Now, ordinarily, the story of my life might not be relevant to a discussion on skepticism, but I have a somewhat unorthodox history and a perspective on these particular issues. I was born here in Vancouver in 1984 to a black Guyanese father and a white German-Irish mother. I spent the part of my life that I don't remember living in False Creek South before my mother got a job at the Vernon Jubilee Hospital and my family moved to the Okanagan. Something that's important to understand about Vernon, especially in the late 1980s, is that it was almost entirely white. As a child, I remember having classmates telling me, "Oh, your hair is weird, doesn't even feel real." And like strangers would come up to me on the street and rub my head. There were 3 other black families in Vernon, and everyone assumed that we were all related. In 1994, my family moved from there to Malton, Ontario. Now, for those of you who have never been, Malton is predominantly black and South Asian. It was a major culture shock for me to move from the monochromatic environs of the Okanagan Valley to the multicultural hub of the country. Now, all of a sudden, I dropped from being too black to not black enough. My friends had 2 black parents to my 1, and they had grown up there, they lived their entire lives in the Caribbean, or in some cases, the African-Canadian communities, whereas I had grown up around cowboys. So after graduating from high school, I completed an undergraduate degree at the University of Waterloo, and then went on to do a master's degree at Queen's University in Kingston. And again, for those of you who have never been to Ontario, these are communities that have tiny black populations. No real history of multiculturalism outside the universities themselves. And once again, I was the black guy in most of my social groups. Following the completion of my degree last October, I moved back here to Vancouver to start my job. Now, Vancouver is a city with a great deal of multiculturalism, but which has strong undercurrents of both racial disparity and racial distrust and enmity. I don't have a degree in race or history or anthropology. My degree is in statistics and epidemiology. The only thing that qualifies me to give this talk today is that I've spent most of my life being on the outside of whatever predominant racial group which was the predominant one in the city I was living in. And I've been making a variety of observations from a number of perspectives on how race and race issues manifest themselves in these different communities. The bulk of what I'm going to talk to you about today comes from material that's written on my blog, the Communist Manifesto. While I've been writing various things like plays and poems, short stories, essays, and so on since I was a kid, this blog is sort of my latest project. I launched it in February of this year, and if there can be said to be a focus, it's race and race issues. But there's also a healthy amount of content about religion, free speech, and humanism. Now, I'm lucky to have been featured 3 times on PZ Myers' blog Pharyngula, so that's been really helpful in terms of traffic and exposure. But mostly it's there for me to organize my thoughts on some of these issues. So the first question we have to ask is a very important one, and that is, what is race? At its simple form, at its very simplest form, race is described according to skin color, but is that a sufficient criterion? I'm going to describe 3 stories to you. The first is my own. As I said, my father is black, my mother is white. We could, if we were being particularly rigorous with our fractions, call me half black. This is what a friend tried to convince me once when I was attending a program for black students interested in medicine. I asked him if he was pure black, and he said he was. The problem is, this guy had freckles. As I pointed out to him, freckles are something that white people get. He also had light skin and straightish hair. It turned out that even though his parents were black, he had white ancestry. So the idea of being pure anything is a little ridiculous and more than a little offensive. But this guy had two titularly black parents, whereas I had only one. Does that qualify him as pure black despite this other stuff that's in his ancestry? This is my friend Erin. Erin and I met at Waterloo. Like me, she has mixed race parentage. Her father's a white man from Scotland, but her mother's history is a bit less straightforward. Erin's mom was adopted by a white family and was raised white. Ancestrally, while she has one black parent and one white parent, she was raised by her adoptive parents to think of herself as a white person. As a result, Erin was raised by two ostensibly white parents. But growing up, Erin quickly realized that she's not white. So this left her with a problem. If she has two white parents, does that not qualify her as a white person? How white do you have to be white enough? How black do you have to be too black? At the same medical program that I talked about a minute ago, I met a young woman named Azza Issa. Now, Azza is from Somalia, which, as you probably know, is a country in northern Africa. Now, Azza has dark skin, but she has long, straight hair, a thin nose, and high cheekbones. This is normal for Somalian women. But she told me that despite her skin color, she had been told all of her life while she was living in Canada that she wasn't really black, because her facial features were different from real black people's. Now, despite her skin color, and despite being born in Africa, she was made to feel as though she wasn't black. So there's apparently some definition of black that's completely separate from either your skin color or your ancestry. And we can see that mere classification by skin color or even by ethnic background is not a sufficient criterion by which to define race. So maybe race has nothing at all to do with parentage. Maybe it's entirely a social construct. Maybe whatever you call yourself is what you are. After all, who is anyone else to tell you, oh, you are this and you are that? Sadly, this definition is also insufficient. I've got a question for you. What do you call someone who's born to a Thai mother and a black father? What if this person engages in a professional field that's been dominated by white people for generations? What happens when he marries a white woman? What do you call this person, given all this context? You call him Tiger Woods. In the racial climate of the United States, especially given the sport of golf, athletics in general, and a history of perception of white women with black men, Tiger Woods is black in pretty much every conceivable way. Despite his occasional protestation, the majority of the world largely ignores his Thai heritage. Even though he self-defines as Thai, the world sees a black guy. Next question. What do you call someone with one black grandparent and whose other family members are all white? What if this person engages in a professional field that's been dominated by black people since it was first invented? What if the majority of this person's followers, friends, etc., are white? What do you call him, given all this context? You call him Slug, leader of the hip-hop group Atmosphere. Now, this guy's probably not as famous to you as Tiger Woods, but Sean here is the leader of a huge underground hip-hop movement in the United States. Hip-hop is a black people thing. Sean calls himself mixed, but to all appearances, he's a white guy. Is he wrong to attribute the label of his heritage to himself? Is he, as might be socially constructed from everything other than his skin color, is he a black guy? I argue, based on these case studies that represent a vast number of people on this planet, and without even going into places like Afghanistan, Nepal, and Brazil that are made up almost exclusively of mixed race people, that race, as we know it, is neither a genetic reality nor is it merely a self-defined social concept. So then what the hell is it? If you're confused, you are in good company. Anyone who claims to have an authoritative definition of the concept, they're lying to you and probably to themselves at the same time. For my own purposes, I'm going to use an operational definition that hopefully satisfies some of your curiosity. And that is that race is a phenomenon that occurs when how you see yourself intersects with how other people see you. There's an interesting anecdote in a book by one of my favorite authors. His name is Lawrence Hill, and he discusses the issues of race among Southern African communities. Now, evidently, in these communities, nobody considers themselves black any more than you or I would define ourselves as being bipedal. The only time race becomes an identifying and self-evident factor is when it has to be contrasted. That is to say, when a white person walks into the room. Now, you'll see that this kind of definition is really no different than any other type of identity, whether it be national, sexual, or gendered. It only becomes relevant when it intersects with someone else's evaluation of you. So now that we've defined our central term, let's talk about racism. Now, we all might think we know what racism is, the burning crosses, lynch mobs, fire hoses turned on crowds, etc. But does that narrow definition really encapsulate the entirety of racism? Let me, in my typical style, provide you with some anecdotes. So the first story, again, is my own. I am, as I said, born to an interracial couple. I self-define as black, not half black, not part black, not mixed. And here's why. When I was about 12 years old, my family moved into a house in a rich white neighborhood. My parents are both university educated, and I had an upbringing that's fairly consistent with having well-educated parents. However, when I would bike along my own street, cop cars would slow down, stare at me, sometimes follow me for blocks. Is that racism? This is my friend Atif. Atif was born in Pakistan, but he spent most of his childhood in England. And nearly 8 years ago, his family moved to Ottawa, where he earned a double major in psychology and kinesiology at Carleton University. He followed that up with a master's degree in epidemiology at Queen's University. Now, Atif is a huge Ottawa Senators fan. I've been to his apartment a bunch of times. It's decked out in team insignia. He's got a beanbag chair that's shaped like a hockey puck with the Senators logo on it. Atif has told me that it's become routine for him to be randomly selected to have his bags searched at the airport. Is that racism? This is Howie. Howie lived in Toronto pretty much his whole life. He's into motorcycling, as you can see, and skydiving and rock climbing, pretty much anything that's dangerous. He's also a medical student, and while he was observing a patient in clinic one day, the patient remarked on his physique. "Of course you're in shape," the guy said. "Rice is really good for you." Is that racism? The answer is, of course, these things are racism. I've never committed a crime in my life, but I get followed around by cops on the street that I live on because I don't fit into the neighborhood. Atif is about as patriotic a Canadian as you could ever want, but he's assumed to be associated with terrorism. Howie's a super active, typical North American guy, but obviously he eats nothing but rice. None of these actually involves active hatred or even dislike on behalf of those who make racist attributions, but they're still racist. So I offer this definition of racism. Racism is the attribution of personal traits to an individual or group of individuals based on his or her ethnic background. Now, it closely parallels this definition from the dictionary, but I disagree with the shoehorning in of the supremacist suggestion in this definition because it implies that there's a deliberate thought process on the part of the racist person that putting themselves above others.